title of the sermon, Family Dynamics, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, probably get some different images in your mind thinking of the good, the bad, and the ugly. You know, you might think of the movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly by Sergio Leone, you know, the one starring Clint Eastwood. In this Western, you know, you have three characters, and you follow these three characters. Blondie, the good character, Angel Eyes, the bad character, and Tuco, the ugly character. The Western follows these three characters, and that's about where the similarity ends, is that we have this great story, this parable that follows three persons. You know, it follows the youngest son, who's the bad. Follows the father, who's good, and it follows the oldest son, who, in the end, acts quite ugly. It's interesting to think about how these relationships go together. You know, how the father relates with each son. The young son, he feels adventurous, and just like most kids who leave home for the first time, whether it be to college or on their own to have an apartment or a house, they kind of have freedom. In this case, the kid abuses his freedom. He uses it in a way that's ill-gotten. He goes and he just squanders his money. You know, right here it doesn't really give much example of what happens. It just says he squanders his money. You don't really get any more detail until we get to the older brother. But he squanders his money, and we all know what that's like. I mean, we've been on our own. We make mistakes. We spend too much money. We get behind on something. I mean, there's always some kind of way, something that we've not been prepared for, or that we have been prepared for, but we didn't take into consideration just because we were young. You know, your parents, and you try to prepare your children for this kind of transition, for being able to go and survive on their own, to be able to live on their own and trust that they'll make the right decisions. You know, the father gives his child in this story the same kind of freedom. But the young son rebels against what he's learned, and he, in a sense, becomes lost. He goes out and he squanders his money, and he ends up on a pig farm. And he's working on a pig farm, and it got so bad that he realized that I'd rather live with my father than as a servant than do this. You know, he looks at the pig's food and almost thinks about eating it. It's what it kind of seems like in the text. He almost considers eating the pig's food. Think about how disgusting that pig's food must be, how hungry he must have been to want to do that. I mean, I don't know. College kids may feel the same way with ramen noodles. I've heard, you know, kids say that ramen noodles, you know, is what got them through college because they're so cheap and inexpensive, but they're rather disgusting in my opinion. No dish on ramen noodles. Some people love them. They're good. But you also see that it gets so bad that he does that. It's so bad that he starts to rehearse what he's going to say to his father. I think it's interesting that, you know, this is such a human characteristic of people, that they rehearse what they're going to say to their father. You know, he goes and you can kind of see him in your mind's eye pacing back and forth saying, "Father, I've sinned against you, and I've sinned against heaven, or I've sinned against heaven and I've sinned against you. You know, I'm not worthy to be your son, I just need to be a servant." And you kind of see that. You kind of see this image of him pacing back and forth, going back and forth, and saying, you know, is this the right thing to say? Is this what I need to say to him? Well, he finally gets the nerve to go back to his father. Because, I mean, that's got to be a scary thing to say to your father. Hey, I failed. I completely messed up. I'm not worthy to be your son anymore. I'll just be your servant. But what you get in this is, you don't see, I mean, it starts out being the story of the lost son, but then the story goes to being found. Fred Craddock, in his commentary on Luke, says that we focus too much on the negative in these things. People often focus too much on the negative. The lost coin, the lost sheep, the lost son, the prodigal son. So you kind of get this idea that that's what the main thrust of the argument is. But Craddock says, no, no, no. The main thrust of the argument is that these things are found. These things are found. The son is found. And all is made right, and they are celebrated. Craddock kind of believes that this story should be more called about the father's love. You know, this is really more about the father's love than it is about the son's rebellion. the Father had to allow the freedom for his Son to go out and make those mistakes. God allows us the same freedom. We have free will. We have free will, but we can abuse it. We can abuse it, and that's what we do. None of us, we're all guilty. We all fall short of the glory of God. We all sin. And that's what the parable is about, is it's about, well, we can always come home to God, And it's interesting, you kind of get the image of the Father gives him the freedom to go, but you kind of see toward the middle of the parable, the Father's on the hill, or he doesn't say he's on a hill, but the Father sees the Son before the Son sees him, and he goes and runs out to him before even the Son can have a word come out of his mouth. And it's interesting to note that it's the Father who sees him. He runs. He's the one that's making the actions. And it would probably be even hard to recognize the Son, because he didn't have any money to his name. He worked in a pig farm. Pigs, they say in their filth, they're covered in mud, which means he would have probably likely been covered in mud and filth and disgustingness. But the Father didn't see that mud. He didn't see the disgustingness. He saw his Son, and the Son that he loved. And he runs out and he embraces his Son. And the Son, he repents. He says, Father, I've sinned against heaven and I've sinned against you. I'm not worthy to be your son. I'm only worthy to be your servant. And the Father says, no, no, no. You are my son. Go get him a ring. Go get him a robe. And get him some sandals. And get a fatted calf. We need all these things. We're going to celebrate because my son was dead, but now he's alive. And we kind of get this idea of that's what God says when he sees us. We make that little turn. We make that little turn in our hearts. And it's not any great work of ours. It's still an act of grace that we can turn toward God. But we make that turn toward God, and God pursues us. It's always God pursuing us. God pursues us and he embraces us. And we make that little turn in our heart, and we say, God, forgive us, and we want you. We need you for salvation. And you get the image of the Father looking through the mud. God looking through the mud and the sin and the awfulness of our lives, and him looking deep into our hearts and showing us love. That love that goes beyond comprehension. This love that sees through all the nastiness. Think about how often we're so superficial when we look at things in a superficial way. If you walk by somebody and they stink, you just think, well, they stink. But God, he looks beyond that. And think about how smelly our sin must be to God. But God looks beyond that. And he looks to our hearts. And he loves us. The Father, he just comes after us. We've been lost and he found us. In grocery stores, I used to work in a grocery store when I was in high school. And every once in a while, a parent would lose a child. And they would desperately look around, their eyes wide, and in deep fear and worry. They're like, where's my child? Where's my child? Please help me find my child. And we get on the little intercom and say, all employees look for such and such. And so, or we'd have code whatever. And so we go and we look for the child. And when the parent found the child, do you think they sit there and they said, you sinned against me, or you did the wrong thing? They may have done that later. They may have said, that was pretty horrible what you did, running off on me in the store like that. But at the time that they saw their child, every time I've ever seen it, a parent runs and they grab their child and they say, I'm so happy to see you. I'm so happy that I found you. And that's what God does with us. He finds us. He looks for us. All we have to do is turn our hearts to him.